Welcome to week 6. We're going to start with the Handbook of Crisis Communication, chapter 20 only. The purpose of the chapter is to explore how organizations use technology during crisis communication. Now, the authors quote Weick, who noted that crises are merely one phase in the life cycle of an organization. According to Weick, the problem for organizations is not the crisis itself. Those are going to happen, but in the organization's response. And this is where we as communicators play such a vital role. We can positively influence the organization's response during a crisis. Now, I'll let you read the handbook yourself, but I will highlight just one part of it, and that's the focus on media richness theory. I highlight this because I've used it in my own career for many years to help make recommendations on the best way to communicate. The idea is that people select richer communication channels that carry greater cues when they feel the situation surrounding the communication is uncertain. Richer channels include face-to-face, maybe the video if you can't meet face-to-face, and then of course there are other communication options all the way down to a text message or an email. The idea, especially as it relates to crisis communication, is that media richness theory can help us understand the best way to respond to the crisis. Side note, it can also help us in our day-to-day communication. You should be thinking about, as a professional communicator, what method is most appropriate for the message and for the audience, right? Those are the two key considerations for all effective communication. So if you send an email and you get a response that was not what you intended, in other words, there's misunderstanding, you're on the wrong channel. So I would encourage you not to send another email unless a quick follow-up is warranted. Otherwise, move up that media richness scale, maybe a phone call, if possible, face-to-face. There is no richer form of communication than that dyadic, look somebody in the eye, face-to-face communication. But as the name implies, it's also rich. In other words, it has a lot of information, but it's also expensive, right? You got to be at the same place at the same time, and that's not always possible. So anyway, not a full lecture on media richness theory, but it is something that I recommend you learn more about if you don't already use it in your day-to-day communication practices. And it certainly has a role to play in crisis communication. Okay, another reading for this week is from Tuning, talking about multiple voices and multiple media. The article explores the impact of information and communication technology on the field of crisis communication. This is another example of the BP oil spill, where the article kind of deconstructs the crisis. And I like that we have these two separate articles. We had one in a prior week about British Petroleum oil spill. Now we've got this one. As an aside, British Petroleum is no longer called British Petroleum. They're now called Beyond Petroleum, partly because of the oil spill, but also because of a different direction they're taking. And there's a communication lesson in that for us. Now, it appears that BP did not engage directly with stakeholders via Facebook. They basically just posted information and used these, word blasts to try to get information out. Sometimes that'll work. Sometimes, you need a little more engagement. And that's just, that's a decision you're going to have to make on your own based upon your own experiences, what's happening at the time, your leadership preferences. There are times that I've advised leaders not to engage. In fact, on more than one occasion, my advice is to leaders is to ignore the haters. When I was working for the Navy's ad agency, we had a Hispanic Heritage Month post, and it was written in Spanish. Kind of makes sense, right? Well, of course, people have their opinions about that. This is the U.S. Navy, and we speak English here. And I'm like, don't engage. Ignore the haters. All you're going to do is just feed whatever fear that those people happen to have when they, lash out like that. And so that was just one simple example of where it's best to ignore it as opposed to try to engage it. But most of the times, our default should be try to engage, and try to help the person understand why we did something. But there are times when that's not the case. Okay, Alt and Thunesen, reputations at risk. The article is based on an in-depth analysis of three multinational profit-making organizations who experienced social media crisis. So there's a lot of good lessons learned in there. One of them is that the authenticity of voice and transparency were crucial. Now, this should sound familiar because in a prior week we talked about the importance of transparency. Are you open to suggestions? Are you providing as much information as early as possible? In the military, we call it maximum disclosure, minimum delay. Those are that's the principles that we guide our communication upon. Okay. And finally, there's Spence, Lachlan, Lynn, and Del Graco. Variability in Twitter content across the stages of natural disasters. I like this article because while Twitter is not the only social media platform, it is the one that gets a lot of use by a lot of news organizations and gets extensive use during a crisis. It's a little more easier to use, some say, and certainly some organizations use it to provide up-to-date information, even over Facebook. I've seen this in my own, crisis communication plans. We'll use Twitter to put out, as much information as early as possible. Maybe use Facebook for a more extensive, if we happen to interview someone or have, a major news release or something that's a little more extensive as opposed to those quick hits that you want to just send out a very quick update, maybe link to a press release or something from Twitter. They talk about how social media is involved to basically become more of an interactive or maybe even collaborative or conversation. And that's true. And again, as I said in a previous week, it's not just about whether you use Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or you name it. The platform itself doesn't matter. There are some basic rules to follow or some guidelines to follow. The idea is that we will always be communicating through social media somehow. Now, the best platform for that depends upon your organization, the message, the audience, your preferences, experiences, those kinds of things. Okay, that is it for this week. I encourage you, as always, to stay ahead with your assignments, stay engaged in the discussion board, and most importantly, of course, always enjoy your time of learning.